It's 2 a.m. on June 11th, 1903. 28 army officers storm the royal palace in Belgrade. They're hunting the king and queen of Serbia. The palace guards, hand-picked men loyal to the crown, try to stop them. The officers cut them down without hesitation. Blood sprays across white marble floors. Screaming. Gunfire. The sound of sabers smashing through mahogany furniture. The officers move methodically, room to room, kicking down doors, overturning beds, tearing apart wardrobes, searching every corner of the massive palace. They're shouting the king's name, demanding he show himself, threatening what they'll do when they find him. The king and queen are hiding. They've locked themselves in a secret room, a tiny panic chamber hidden behind a wardrobe in the queen's bedroom. It's barely large enough for 2 people. No windows, no light. They're pressed against the back wall in total darkness, wearing only their nightclothes, barely breathing, listening to the boots getting closer. They can hear everything. The officers smashing furniture in the next room, the shouts, the threats. Find them! They can't have gone far. Someone kicks open the bedroom door. Footsteps cross the floor. The queen grabs the king's hand. She's trembling. He whispers that they'll be safe, that the officers won't find them, that help will come. He's wrong. The officers find the wardrobe. They tear it apart, throwing clothes and jewels across the floor. They find the hidden door. They try to break it down with rifle butts. The wood is too thick. They try shooting through it. The bullets don't penetrate. So they send for dynamite from the palace arsenal, small demolition charges meant for clearing obstacles. They pack the explosives against the doorframe. Everyone steps back. The explosion blows the door off its hinges. Smoke fills the tiny chamber. And there, pressed against the back wall in their nightclothes, frozen in terror, are King Alexander Obrenović and Queen Draga. What happens next takes less than 3 minutes. But those 3 minutes will end a dynasty that ruled Serbia for most of a century. Draga screams. Alexander steps in front of her, trying to shield her with his body. The officers surge forward. Multiple men fire revolvers at point-blank range. Alexander is hit in the chest, the face, the arms. He collapses. Draga is shot in the stomach and legs. She falls on top of her husband. Both are still moving, still breathing. The officers don't stop. They hack at the bodies with sabers, slashing, chopping, making absolutely certain they're dead. Over 30 bullet wounds between them. Saber cuts across their faces, chests, arms. Blood pools on the floor of the secret room, flows out into the bedroom. Finally, both are still. The king and queen of Serbia are dead, but the officers aren't finished. Not even close. Someone says, "Strip them, throw them out the window. Let the people see what traitors look like." They tear off the king's nightshirt. They rip the queen's nightgown away. Both bodies are completely naked. They carry them to a window overlooking the palace garden, and they throw them out, 2 stories down. The naked body of King Alexander Obrenović, 26 years old, lands hard in the garden dirt. The naked body of Queen Draga Masin Obrenović, 38 years old, lands beside him. The bodies lie there for hours. Inside the palace, officers celebrate. They drink the king's wine. They ransack the royal apartments, taking jewelry, documents, anything of value. Outside, as dawn breaks over Belgrade, servants and citizens begin to gather. They stand in silence, staring at the corpses of their king and queen lying naked in the garden, on display like slaughtered animals. By morning, the Obrenović dynasty, a family that had ruled Serbia through wars, revolutions, and political chaos for 86 years, is extinct, wiped out in a single night of coordinated violence so brutal that European monarchs will refuse to recognize the new Serbian government for years. This is the story of how it happened, how a 26-year-old king's scandalous marriage to a woman 12 years his senior, his own mother's lady-in-waiting, triggered a conspiracy that ended in dynamite, sabers, and 2 bodies thrown naked from a palace window. To understand why the Obrenovićes died the way they did, you need to understand where they came from. The dynasty was born in blood and rebellion, and it would die the same way. In 1815, Serbia was part of the Ottoman Empire. It had been for 4 centuries. But Serbian nationalism was rising, and a wealthy pig farmer named Miloš Obrenović became the leader of the Second Serbian Uprising against Ottoman rule. He was ruthless, politically brilliant, and absolutely committed to Serbian independence. By 1817, the Ottomans granted Serbia autonomous status within the empire. Miloš became Prince of Serbia, not quite a king, but the de facto ruler of an autonomous principality. He ruled with an iron fist, centralizing power, eliminating rivals, building the foundations of a modern state. But he had enemies. Chief among them was Karađorđe Petrović, the leader of the First Serbian Uprising in 1804. Karađorđe had fled to Austria after the Ottomans crushed the First Rebellion. In 1817, he returned to Serbia. Miloš saw him as a threat. On July 25, 1817, Karađorđe was assassinated. Most historians believe Miloš ordered it. That murder created a blood feud that would haunt Serbia for nearly a century. The Karađorđević family, Karađorđe's descendants, would spend generations trying to reclaim power from the Obrenovićes. The throne would change hands between the two families multiple times through coups, abdications, assassinations, and political maneuvering. Miloš ruled until 1839, when he was forced to abdicate. His son Milan succeeded him, but died within a month, possibly poisoned. His other son Michael became prince, but was overthrown in 1842 by supporters of the Karađorđevićes. Alexander Karađorđević ruled until 1858, when Michael Obrenović returned and took power again. This is the chaotic, violent world Alexander Obrenović was born into. His family's hold on power was never secure. Rivals always waited. Coups were always possible. And the army, the men with guns, held the real power behind the throne. Alexander Obrenović was born August 14, 1876 at the Royal Palace in Belgrade. His father, Milan Obrenović, was Prince of Serbia. His mother, Natalia Keshko, was a Russian noblewoman, beautiful and strong-willed. From birth, Alexander's life was defined by his parents' hatred for each other. Milan was a womanizer, a compulsive gambler, and a weak ruler controlled by Austria-Hungary. He kept mistresses openly. He spent state funds on personal pleasures. He made disastrous political decisions that weakened Serbia. Natalia despised him. She was intelligent, educated, politically savvy. Everything Milan wasn't. She tried to influence policy. She built her own network of supporters. She became more popular with the Serbian people than her own husband. Milan saw her as a threat. Their marriage became a public spectacle of mutual destruction. Screaming fights that servants overheard, separate residences, competing court factions. Young Alexander was caught in the middle, used as a pawn by both parents, never knowing which one to trust. In 1886, when Alexander was 10, Milan declared war on Bulgaria. It was a catastrophe. The Serbian army was crushed. Milan sued for peace and had to accept humiliating terms dictated by Austria-Hungary. His popularity collapsed. Natalia openly criticized him. The marriage finally exploded. In 1888, Milan and Natalia divorced, a scandal that shocked Europe. Orthodox monarchs didn't divorce. But Milan didn't care. He wanted Natalia gone. The court ruled that Alexander would live with his father and that Natalia was forbidden from seeing her son without Milan's permission. Then, in 1889, Milan did something even more shocking. He abdicated. He was 41 years old, sick of ruling, sick of responsibility. He handed the throne to his 13-year-old son Alexander and left for Paris to live in luxury. Alexander became king of Serbia at 13, but he was too young to rule, so a regency council was established. 3 politicians who would govern until Alexander turned 18. His mother was still in exile, forbidden from entering Serbia. His father was in Paris, spending money. Alexander was alone, controlled by regents who used him as a symbol while they held real power. He grew up isolated, paranoid, desperate for affection. And in 1893, he did something that changed everything. On April 13th, 1893, he gathered loyal army officers, marched into the Parliament building, and declared himself of legal age to rule. The regents protested. Alexander arrested them. It was audacious. It was legally questionable, but it worked. The army supported him. The people accepted it. And overnight, the 16-year-old king became the actual ruler of Serbia. His first act was to recall his mother from exile. Natalia returned to Belgrade in triumph. She moved into the palace. She became her son's closest advisor. She chose his ministers. She vetted his decisions. She controlled who had access to him. For the next 7 years, Alexander ruled Serbia with his mother's guidance. And his mother had a trusted lady-in-waiting who helped manage the young king's life. A widow, elegant, intelligent, 12 years older than Alexander. Her name was Draga Mashin. At first, she was just part of his mother's household, but Alexander noticed her. She was beautiful, tall, dark-haired, with striking eyes and a commanding presence. She was also kind to him. She listened when he talked. She gave him advice without condescension. She made him feel understood. For a young man who'd spent his life controlled by others, who'd never known genuine affection, Draga was intoxicating. By 1897, when Alexander was 21 and Draga was 33, rumors began spreading through the Belgrade court. The king and his mother's lady-in-waiting were having an affair. Secret meetings, private conversations, the way he looked at her. Queen Natalia was horrified. This wasn't what she'd intended when she brought Draga into the palace. Draga Mashin was born September 11th, 1864, in Gornji Milanovac, a small town in central Serbia. Her father, Panta Mashin, was a minor official. Her mother, Hristina, came from a slightly higher social class. Draga was the eldest of 6 children. She grew up in a Serbia that was modernizing, but still deeply traditional. Women of her class had limited options, marriage primarily, and Draga was beautiful enough to attract attention. In 1883, when she was 19, she married Svetozar Mashin, a Czech engineer working in Serbia. The marriage gave her status, security, a comfortable life, but it didn't last. Svetozar was significantly older. He traveled frequently for work. There were no children. And in 1885, after only 2 years of marriage, Svetozar died. Some sources say illness. Others hint at suicide. The truth was never clear. Draga was 21, widowed, childless, without independent means. In 1880 Serbia, that was a precarious position. She needed work. She needed protection. She turned to connections. Through family friends, she secured a position as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Natalia. It was prestigious work for a woman of her background. She would attend the Queen, travel with her, manage her household affairs. It was a lifeline. Draga proved excellent at the job. She was intelligent, discreet, loyal. When Natalia was exiled after her divorce, Draga went with her. They lived in Wiesbaden, Germany, then Biarritz, France. Draga was more than an employee. She became Natalia's confidant and friend. When Alexander recalled his mother in 1893, Draga returned to Belgrade. She was 29. She'd spent years in European courts, learned languages, observed how power worked. She was sophisticated, worldly, charming. And the 17-year-old king noticed. The relationship developed slowly at first. Alexander would ask Draga to read to him. They'd discuss books, politics, life. She was maternal, affectionate, understanding. Everything he'd never had. For Draga, the king's attention was flattering, dangerous, and potentially transformative. If she played it right, she could rise from lady-in-waiting to something far greater. By 1899, they were lovers. Alexander was 23. Draga was 35. Queen Natalia confronted her, demanded she leave court. Draga refused. Alexander supported her publicly. The relationship was out in the open now. And then Alexander announced he would marry her. The announcement sent shockwaves through Serbia and Europe. King Alexander of Serbia intended to marry Draga Mašin, a commoner, a widow, his mother's lady-in-waiting, and 12 years his senior. The reaction was immediate and universally negative. Queen Natalia publicly denounced the marriage. She wrote to European newspapers calling it a disaster. She left Belgrade forever, moving to Paris, where she would spend the rest of her life in bitter exile. The entire Serbian cabinet resigned in protest, every minister. The Prime Minister gave a speech saying he could not serve a king who made such a catastrophic personal choice. The Orthodox Church opposed the marriage. Church law technically allowed widows to remarry, but there were concerns. Medical opinion at the time held that women in their mid-30s were unlikely to produce healthy heirs. The church hierarchy worried the marriage would leave Serbia without a succession. The army officer corps was appalled. Many had served Alexander's father. They'd watched the young king grow up. And now he was marrying his mother's servant, a woman older than him? It was seen as weak, undignified, beneath a monarch. European royal houses refused to attend the wedding. No foreign royalty would legitimize this union. Austria-Hungary, Russia, Britain, all made their disapproval clear. Alexander didn't care, or perhaps he did care, but was too stubborn, too in love, too controlled by Draga to back down. On August 5, 1900, he married Draga Mašin in a small ceremony at the royal chapel. Almost no one attended. His mother was in Paris. His father was in Paris. The cabinet had resigned. The church reluctantly performed the ceremony. Queen Draga of Serbia was now the most hated woman in the country. And then she made everything infinitely worse. In early 1901, 6 months after the wedding, Queen Draga announced she was pregnant. Palace officials released the news. Newspapers reported it. Serbia celebrated, finally an heir to secure the dynasty. But as weeks turned to months, something felt wrong. Draga's pregnancy seemed strange. She refused to let court physicians examine her. She insisted on complete privacy. She would appear in public wearing loose gowns, her belly seemingly growing. But no doctor was allowed to confirm anything. Rumors started circulating in Belgrade society. Servants whispered that they'd seen the queen stuffing pillows under her dress. Court insiders questioned why she refused medical examination. Opposition newspapers began publishing veiled suggestions that the pregnancy wasn't real. The scandal grew. Foreign newspapers picked up the story. The Times of London ran articles questioning whether the Queen of Serbia was faking a pregnancy with cushions. It became an international embarrassment. By summer 1901, Draga should have been near term, but still no doctors. No confirmation. Just the Queen appearing in public with her mysterious belly. Then in September, everything collapsed. Palace officials announced that Queen Draga had suffered a miscarriage. But no physicians had attended her. No medical evidence was produced. The announcement was vague, suspicious. The Serbian public became convinced she'd been faking it all along. The most charitable interpretation was that she genuinely believed herself pregnant. The less charitable and more widely believed version was that she'd been stuffing pillows under her dress, planning to adopt or buy a baby and pass it off as the king's child to secure her position. The scandal destroyed what little legitimacy Draga had. She went from unpopular to actively hated. Newspapers openly called her a fraud. Political cartoons showed her with pillows falling out of her dress. Army officers mocked her in taverns. The Orthodox Church refused to defend her. And Alexander, instead of distancing himself, became even more protective and paranoid. After the pregnancy scandal, Alexander made a series of catastrophic decisions that set him on a collision course with his own military. First, he promoted Draga's brothers, Nikola and Nikodije Lunjevića, to high military positions. Neither man had significant military experience or qualifications. But suddenly, they were commanding regiments, making decisions about troop deployments, drawing generous salaries. Army officers who'd served for decades watched these unqualified men leapfrog over them because they were related to the hated queen. Second, Alexander began dismissing any officer who criticized Draga. If someone made a joke about the queen in a tavern and it got back to the palace, they'd be stripped of rank. If an officer publicly questioned the Lunjevica promotions, they'd be reassigned to some distant outpost. The message was clear. Loyalty to the queen was required, even if it meant betraying professional judgment. Third, Alexander isolated himself. He stopped attending public functions. He stopped meeting with his ministers regularly. He and Draga stayed in the palace, surrounded by her family members and a shrinking circle of loyalists. The King of Serbia had become a prisoner of his own choices. Outside the palace walls, anger festered. Army officers met in cafes and private homes. They discussed the situation in hushed tones. The king had betrayed them. He promoted unqualified men because of his obsession with a woman who'd probably faked a pregnancy. Serbia was becoming a laughingstock. Something had to be done. The conspiracy to assassinate King Alexander and Queen Draga began in 1901, but it took 2 years to organize properly. The ringleader was Captain Dragutin Dmitrievich, who would later become famous under the codename Apis. He was a fierce Serbian nationalist, a brilliant military strategist, and a man who believed that Alexander's marriage to Draga was actively destroying the country. Dmitrievich began recruiting carefully. He needed men who were loyal to Serbia above the crown, men who were willing to commit regicide, men who could keep a secret. He found them in the younger officer corps, captains, lieutenants, majors who'd watched their careers stall while Draga's unqualified brothers advanced. Men who'd served in the disastrous war against Bulgaria and blamed weak leadership. Men who saw Alexander as a puppet controlled by his wife. By 1903, the conspiracy had 28 committed members. They swore oaths of secrecy. They planned meticulously. They studied the palace layout, guard rotations, escape routes. They coordinated with politicians who would support a new government. And they chose their preferred successor, Peter Karađorđević, from the rival dynasty that the Obrenovićes had displaced decades earlier. Peter was living in exile in Switzerland. He was mild-mannered, educated, democratic in temperament. The conspirators sent emissaries to sound him out. Would he accept the crown if it were offered? Peter was cautious but didn't say no. That was enough. The conspirators chose their date, the night of June 10th to 11th, 1903. That night, King Alexander was hosting a small dinner at the palace. By midnight, most guests would be gone. The palace guard would be minimal. It was the perfect opportunity. They divided into groups. One group would neutralize the palace guards, another would search for the king and queen, a third would secure the palace grounds and prevent escape. They synchronized watches. They prepared their weapons, sabers, revolvers, and just in case, dynamite from the military arsenal. At 2 a.m. on June 11th, they moved. 28 officers approached the royal palace on foot. They wore their uniforms. They carried their weapons openly. The palace gates should have been locked, but conspirators inside had left them open. They entered without resistance. The first obstacle was the palace guard commander, a man named Lazar Petrovich. He was loyal to the king. When he saw armed officers entering the palace at 2 a.m., he knew what was happening. He tried to sound the alarm. The conspirators cut him down with sabers. He died on the palace steps. Another guard, hearing the commotion, ran to warn the king. The conspirators shot him in the back. He collapsed in a palace corridor, bleeding out on Persian carpets. A servant, a woman, saw what was happening and screamed. She ran toward the royal apartments. An officer caught her, put a hand over her mouth, and threatened to kill her if she made another sound. She went silent, trembling. The officers moved deeper into the palace, room by room. They kicked down doors. They overturned beds, checking if anyone was hiding underneath. They smashed open wardrobes with sabers. They were shouting, "Where is he? Where's the tyrant? Show yourself!" Alexander and Draga had been awakened by the first gunshots. A loyal servant, one who survived, managed to reach them and warn them. "The army is in the palace. They're coming to kill you." The king and queen understood immediately what was happening. This was a coup, an assassination attempt. They had minutes, maybe seconds. Alexander grabbed Draga's hand and pulled her toward her bedroom. Behind a large wardrobe, there was a hidden door, a panic room that few people knew about. It was tiny, barely 6 feet by 4 feet, meant as a last resort hiding place. They squeezed inside, pulled the door shut, and pushed the wardrobe against it from the inside as best they could. Then they waited in total darkness, pressed against the back wall, hardly breathing. The officers were getting frustrated. They'd been searching for nearly 2 hours. They'd turned the palace inside out. Where were the king and queen? Had they escaped through a secret tunnel? Had the conspiracy failed? Some officers began to panic. If Alexander escaped, he could rally loyalist troops. The conspirators would be arrested, tried, executed. Everything depended on finding him. Captain Dmitrievich methodically retraced their search. They checked every bedroom, every sitting room, every closet. But had they checked behind every piece of furniture? He went back to the Queen's bedroom. The bed was overturned. The armoires were open, contents spilled. But that wardrobe against the far wall, it looked wrong. Too flush against the wall. Positioned oddly. He ordered men to pull it away. They grabbed it, yanked. It was heavy, wedged against something. They pulled harder. The wardrobe moved. And behind it, barely visible, was a door. Dmitrievich smiled coldly. "They're in there." He pounded on the door. "Come out! It's over!" Silence from inside. He tried the handle. Locked. He ordered men to break it down. They slammed rifle butts against it. The wood was thick, reinforced. They tried shooting the lock. The bullets ricocheted. The door wouldn't budge. Someone said, "We have dynamite." They sent a man to the palace arsenal. He returned with small demolition charges, the kind used for clearing obstacles in military engineering. The officers knew how to use them. They packed the explosive carefully against the door frame, taking care not to use so much that it would collapse the wall. Everyone backed up. Someone lit the fuse. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed bedroom. Smoke filled the air. When it cleared, the door was blown off its hinges, hanging at an angle. Captain Dmitrievich stepped forward, revolver drawn. He looked into the tiny room. In the darkness, lit only by the lamps from the bedroom, he saw them. King Alexander, 26 years old, in his nightshirt, standing in front of his wife. Queen Draga, 38 years old, in her nightgown, pressed against the back wall, wide-eyed with terror. For just a moment, everyone froze. King and subjects, monarch and rebels. The end of one world and the beginning of another. Then Draga screamed. Multiple officers surged into the tiny room at once. Alexander tried to speak. "Please, I'll abdicate. Just let us live." But his words were drowned out by gunfire. 4, 5, 6 officers fired revolvers simultaneously at point-blank range. The sound was deafening. Alexander was hit in the chest, the shoulder, the face. Blood sprayed against the walls. He collapsed, falling backward onto Draga. She screamed again, trying to catch him, and was immediately shot. Bullets hit her in the stomach, the legs, the shoulder. Both went down in a heap of blood and torn nightclothes. But they weren't dead yet. Alexander was gasping, his chest heaving. Draga was moaning, clutching her stomach where blood was pouring out. The officers didn't hesitate. Several men stepped forward with drawn sabers. They hacked at the bodies, slashing, chopping, making absolutely certain. The sabers cut across Alexander's face, his chest, his arms. They slashed Draga's throat, her face, her body. Blood pooled on the floor, so much blood that it flowed out of the tiny room into the bedroom. After perhaps a minute of sustained violence, both were finally still. King Alexander Obrenovich had over 30 bullet and saber wounds. Queen Draga had more than 20. Both were dead. The officers stood there, breathing hard, covered in blood. Someone said, "What now?" Captain Dmitrievich looked at the bodies. "Strip them, throw them out the window, let the people see." Several men hesitated. These were still the king and queen, even dead. But Dmitrievich insisted. They need to see. Serbia needs to know the tyrants are gone. They dragged the bodies out of the secret room into the bedroom. They tore off Alexander's nightshirt, leaving him completely naked. They ripped away Draga's nightgown, exposing her body. Then they carried both corpses to a window overlooking the palace garden. The window was about 20 feet above the ground. One officer pushed it open. Two men lifted Alexander's naked body and threw it out. It fell, limbs flailing, and hit the ground with a sickening thud. Then they threw Draga. Her body tumbled through the air and landed beside her husband in the dirt. Both bodies lay there, naked, bleeding, broken. Inside the palace, the officers celebrated, began to break over Belgrade. Palace began to break over Belgrade. Palace servants and early rising citizens began to gather in the garden. They stood in shocked silence, staring at the naked corpses of their king and queen, lying in the dirt like slaughtered animals. By 6 a.m., hundreds of people had gathered. Some wept. Some cursed the dead king and queen. Some just stared in numb disbelief. The bodies lay there until mid-morning, when finally someone thought to cover them with sheets. But the conspirators still weren't finished with their night's work. Draga's two brothers, Nikola and Nikodija Lunjevica, were also targets. They'd been promoted to high military rank by Alexander, despite having no qualifications. The conspirators despised them as symbols of everything wrong with the regime. Nikola Lunjevica was at his residence when a group of officers arrived at 3 a.m. They dragged him outside in his nightclothes. He begged for his life, saying he'd leave Serbia, that he'd never been involved in politics. The officers shot him in the street. His body was left there until morning. Nikodija Lunjevica tried to hide in a friend's house. The conspirators found him. He was executed on the spot, multiple gunshots, no trial, no mercy. His body was dumped in an alley. By sunrise on June 11, 1903, the Obrenović dynasty was extinct. King Alexander, dead. Queen Draga, dead. Her brothers, dead. Several loyalist ministers were also killed in the chaos. The palace was soaked in blood, and Serbia had no government. Within hours, the conspirators proclaimed Peter Karađorđević as the new king of Serbia. Peter was 60 years old, living quietly in Switzerland. He was from the dynasty that had fought the Obrenovićes throughout the 19th century. The conspirators sent a telegram. "The throne is yours if you want it." Peter accepted. He arrived in Belgrade on June 24, 1903. He was crowned King Peter I of Serbia. The conspiracy's political wing formed a new government. The officer corps was purged of any remaining Obrenović loyalists. It looked like a clean transition. But Europe was appalled. The assassination wasn't just brutal, it was barbaric. The Queen thrown naked from a window, the King's body displayed like a hunting trophy. It was beyond the pale. King Edward VII of Britain refused to receive Serbian diplomats. Austria-Hungary condemned the murders publicly. Russia, traditionally Serbia's ally, hesitated to recognize the new government. For 2 years, Serbia was effectively isolated diplomatically. The officers who carried out the assassination became heroes in Serbia. They were celebrated as patriots who saved the nation. But they were also pariahs internationally. Some were quietly forced to resign. Others were pushed into early retirement. Captain Dmitrievich, Apis, would go on to found the Black Hand, the secret society that organized the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, triggering World War I. Peter I ruled until 1918. He was succeeded by his son Alexander I Karađorđević, who became king of the newly formed Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes. But violence would haunt them too. Alexander I was assassinated in Marseille in 1934, the first assassination of a head of state caught on film. The royal palace in Belgrade still stands. It's now a museum. You can visit it. You can see the window from which the bodies were thrown. There's a small plaque marking it. You can walk through the rooms where the officers searched. You can stand in the Queen's bedroom, where the wardrobe once hid a secret room. Your Obrenović family is extinct. No descendants remain. The Karađorđevićes produced the last Yugoslav monarchs. The current claimant to the Serbian throne is Alexander II, Crown Prince of Yugoslavia, who lives in Belgrade and advocates for restored monarchy in Serbia. But Serbia is a republic now and has been for over 70 years. Restoration is unlikely. The bodies of King Alexander and Queen Draga were eventually buried at the Church of St. Mark in Belgrade. Their graves are simple, understated. Few people visit them. The dynasty they belong to has largely been forgotten outside Serbia. But the story of how they died, 28 officers, dynamite, sabers, naked bodies thrown from a palace window, remains one of the most brutal royal assassinations in history. The Obrenovićes weren't the only royal family to end in violence. When the Romanovs fell in Russia 15 years later, Tsar Nicholas II and his family faced Bolshevik firing squads in a basement. When the Habsburgs collapsed, their empire dissolved into chaos. When the Hohenzollerns lost power, Kaiser Wilhelm fled to Holland in exile. But the Obrenovićes hold a unique place in that bloody history. They were the dynasty that ended with its last king and queen thrown naked from a palace window, their bodies left on display in the dirt, while their killers celebrated inside with the royal wine. It was a brutal end to a dynasty born in rebellion, sustained through political violence, and destroyed by one catastrophic marriage. The woman who was 12 years older, the woman who'd been his mother's lady-in-waiting, the woman who'd faked a pregnancy and promoted her unqualified brothers. She died naked in a palace garden, beside the 26-year-old king who'd chosen her over his throne